The summons came on a Tuesday, which Lena Vasquez had already decided was the worst day of the week. Mondays you could hate on principle. Wednesdays were the hinge. But Tuesdays just existed, gray and purposeless, like a bureaucratic placeholder between things that mattered. She was in the middle of her fourth cup of coffee and her second hour of staring at a ceiling tile when Commander Reyes knocked on the frame of her. Open door. Admiral Cho wants you. Vasquez didn't move. Tell him I'm reviewing mission telemetry. You're staring at the ceiling, reviewing it internally. Reyes had the good sense not to argue further. He just stood there with the particular expression of a man who understood her situation perfectly and felt terrible about it. That expression, more than anything, made her set down the cup. She had been groundside for 11 months. The official language was administrative reassignment, pending psychological evaluation completion, which was a long way of saying they didn't know what to do with her. The Kessel engagement had not been what anyone planned. 6 ships had gone in, 4 had come back, and 2 of those 4 had come back wrong. Hull integrity holding, but something internal compromised, a structural correctness masking damage that the instruments couldn't name. Vasquez had brought the Meridian home. That was the official record. The unofficial record, the one that existed only in the silence of debriefs and the careful wording of psychological evaluations, was considerably more complicated. She wore her uniform anyway, every day, because the alternative was admitting she was waiting. She hated waiting. Admiral Cho's office on the 14th floor of Earth Command Central had a view of the harbor. He was standing at the window when she entered, which she had expected. Admirals with difficult news always positioned themselves near windows, as though the distance gave them something to look at when the conversation got hard. He was a small man with a large reputation, and he turned to face her with the measure computer of someone who had rehearsed the opening. Captain Vasquez, Admiral. Sit down. She sat, because this clearly wasn't a dressing down, and she was curious enough to be patient for once. Cho set a data tablet on the desk between them. She didn't reach for it yet. What I'm about to tell you doesn't leave this office, he said. I don't talk to many people these days. He ignored that. With the Dust Hollow system, she was, faintly, a red dwarf system at the outer terminus of the Vandermeer corridor. One of those stub-end systems that had been cataloged and flagged, and then essentially left alone, because the corridor itself was barely worth maintaining, and the system at its end had initially presented as resource poor, dry planet, thin atmosphere, seismic activity that made long-term settlement inadvisable. She had read the survey file, the same way she had read hundreds of survey files. Once thoroughly, then filed it in the part of her memory she reserved for things that probably wouldn't matter. It showed up in the survey catalog about 6 years ago, she said. Nothing remarkable. That was before we knew about the Venkai. She waited. An indigenous spacefaring civilization, Cho said, with technology roughly analogous to our own, but developed along entirely different lines. They've been aware of us for approximately 4 years. Initial contact was made by a survey team 18 months ago. Cordial, structured, careful. They're not hostile. They're cautious. Then why am I here? Cho clasped his hands on the desk in a way that suggested the answer was complicated. The Venkai have something we need. A mineral compound they call Vareth. It occurs naturally in the rock formations of Dusk Hollow's northern continent, and its energy catalytic properties are, frankly, Captain, they're transformative. The propulsion applications alone would change everything about how we move through deep space, and they're willing to trade access. Under what conditions? That's what we don't know yet. They've agreed to a formal negotiation, but they've specified parameters. A small delegation, 1 ship, a captain with the authority to make binding commitments on behalf of Earth Command. He paused. And they've asked for someone who has experience with loss. The room was quiet for a moment. They asked specifically for that. In their initial communication, they described the qualities of the representative they would find credible. That the translation is imprecise. Our linguistic team has been working with it for months. But the phrase that keeps coming back, the closest rendering, is something like, one who has paid the price of understanding. We believe they've done significant research on us. They may know about the Kessel engagement. Vasquez looked at the tablet on the desk. She didn't reach for it. You're asking me to go to the edge of charted space and negotiate a resource treaty with an alien civilization I've never encountered, based partly on the qualification that I've had a very bad year. I'm asking you to command the Meridian on a mission that could fundamentally change humanity's reach in this sector of the galaxy. He leaned forward slightly. I'm also telling you that the alternative to this mission, from your perspective, involves another 4 months of psychological evaluation and a desk that will still be there waiting for you when they're done. She looked at him for a long moment. He held it steadily. You could have just led with that, she said. I wanted to give you the full picture first. She reached for the tablet. The Meridian had been refitted in her absence. New propulsion relays, upgraded sensor arrays. The secondary medical bay expanded to accommodate the kind of long-range mission profile that the shipyard engineers apparently believed in more than she did. She walked the corridors before departure the way she always did, slow and alone, running her hand along bulkheads the way some people touched wood for luck. This was not superstition. It was inventory. You needed to know the ship in your body, not just your mind. Needed to feel which corridor ran slightly cold, which junction hummed at a frequency that meant the conduit behind was working hard, where the deck plating had been replaced and hadn't fully settled yet. The Meridian spoke in those small details, and she had learned to listen. Her crew had been assembled for her, which she noted without comment. She would have preferred to hand-pick them, but hand-picking required time, and command wanted departure in 72 hours. She reviewed the files instead. Her XO was Lieutenant Commander Jonas Ibarra, 34, 3 deep space tours, a record that was clean in the way that suggested both competence and the absence of the kind of situations that would have tested him past his limits. She reserved judgment on that. Dr. Cressida Morvain held the chief medical position, 61 years old, which meant she had seen things. The file listed 4 prior first contact medical situations, which was unusual. Most CMOs at her experience level had 1 or 2. She had also apparently spent 3 years on a cultural exchange rotation in a frontier station, which was rarer still, and, Vasquez thought, probably the most useful thing on the whole CV. Science Officer Lieutenant Dae Jung Park was the youngest of the senior staff, 27, with a specialization in xenochemistry that made him exactly the right person to have aboard for a mission centered on an alien mineral compound. His secondary qualification was xenolinguistics, which was almost suspiciously convenient, and she found herself wondering whether someone at command had been more thoughtful about this crew than the speed of assembly suggested. Engineer Senior Chief Marta Bautista had 40 years of service, which was the kind of number that stopped being impressive and started being something else entirely, a kind of permanent residency in the machinery of the ships that had defined her life. Vasquez had heard of her obliquely, through the kind of reputation that didn't make its way into official files. Bautista could fix things that shouldn't be fixable. She apparently had strong opinions about coffee, which Vasquez considered a point in her favor. The 5th person she flagged in the files was not a crew member in the traditional sense. The manifest listed a Venkai cultural liaison named Sarath, attached to the mission by agreement between Earth Command and the Venkai diplomatic office. The file was thin, a photograph of the tall, gray-skinned figure with the large orbital structure and downward-sloping facial ridge that the initial contact reports had described, and a single-line notation that read, Designation, Facilitator, Purpose, Communication Support, and Cultural Interpretation. Vasquez stared at the photograph for longer than she needed to. There was something in the face, not expression exactly. Because the Venkai apparently had a facial musculature that didn't map cleanly onto human emotion, but something in the posture, the angle of the chin, the placement of the hands in the image. It looked, to Vasquez's eye, like someone who had been disappointed a great many times and had decided to be patient about it anyway. She recognized that. Tesserath was already aboard when Vasquez arrived for the final departure check. She found the liaison in the forward observation lounge, standing at the viewport with the stillness of someone who had learned that humans sometimes needed to watch you for a while before they were ready to approach. Tesserath, Vasquez said. The voice was low and precise, with a cadence that was almost musical. Each syllable weighted differently, so that the name came out like something deliberate. I appreciate that you came to find me rather than summoning me. I figured you'd been summoned enough in the last few months. She stood beside the alien at the viewport, looking out at the dock framework. How long have you been working with Earth Command? 14 of your months, since the initial contact was formalized. A pause. I have spent considerable time studying human patterns of communication. I find that the most instructive element is not what humans say, but the distance they maintain when they say it. Vasquez glanced sideways. And what does my distance tell you? That you are someone who has learned that closeness carries cost. Tesserath turned to look at her with those large, slightly luminous eyes. The Admiral chose well. The Venkai Council will find you credible. Because I've had a bad year. Because you have survived what you did not expect to survive, Tesserath said, with a precision that landed without cruelty, and you have not pretended otherwise. The Venkai have a word for this. There is no clean translation, but the nearest equivalent in your language would be something like one who knows the weight of what they carry. Vasquez looked back at the viewport. Tell me about the Venkai, she said. Not the file version. Your version. Tesserath considered this for a moment, with the quality of consideration that suggested it was genuinely thinking, rather than performing thought. They are a people who believe that understanding must be earned through cost, that any position of knowledge or authority that was not purchased through genuine risk is inherently unstable, likely to collapse at the first real pressure. They distrust ease. They distrust comfort. They are not cruel. They do not seek suffering, but they regard those who have not suffered as fundamentally untested, and they do not negotiate with untested things. That sounds exhausting. Many human visitors have found them so. A faint shift in Tesserath's expression. Not quite a smile, but something in the region of one. But I think you will not. The Vandermeer corridor took 12 days at standard cruising speed. Vasquez spent them learning her ship again, and learning her crew, which were related activities. She ran drills. She ate dinner with different combinations of officers. She spent 2 evenings in the engine room with Bautista, mostly listening, while the older woman described the modifications she had made to the secondary manifold exchange, which were apparently unauthorized and definitely necessary. Command approved the specs, Bautista said, without looking up from the panel she was calibrating. But they always approve specs that are too conservative. The original relay timing assumes we're going to stay in the corridor the whole way, and then cruise into Dusk Hollow space at survey speed. I've reset the ignition sequence so we can push past that if we need to. If we need to, Vasquez repeated. Things happen. Vasquez handed her a tool she seemed to be looking for. What kind of things? Bautista looked up for the first time and gave her the measured assessment of someone who had served under enough captains to have developed a reliable taxonomy. The kind that made someone at command decide to refit the secondary medical bay, she said. On the 6th day out, Park presented his preliminary analysis of the Verith compound to the senior staff. He had worked primarily from the Venkai sample data that had been included in the treaty briefing, and his findings were, as he put it, with the barely suppressed excitement of someone who had found the most interesting thing in several adjacent rooms. Genuinely extraordinary. The energy catalytic properties are stable across a temperature range 4 times wider than anything we currently use, he said, pulling up the molecular diagram on the briefing room display. And the reaction yield, when integrated with our current propulsion architecture, would extend range by a conservative estimate of 60 to 70%, possibly more. The Venkai have been using it for decades in their own propulsion systems, but their technology took a different evolutionary path, so they haven't fully exploited what it can do. What's the catch? Ibarra asked. It's only accessible on Dusk Hollow, Park said. The formation process requires a very specific combination of geological and atmospheric conditions. It's not something you can synthesize. So we need access to the planet, Vasquez said. We need access to the northern continent specifically. The Venkai have settlements there. Not large ones, but significant. The Verith deposits are distributed across about 2,000 square kilometers of territory that they consider culturally important. Culturally important how? Park glanced at Tesserath, who had been sitting at the far end of the table, in the particular way the Venkai liaison had of being present without occupying space. Tesserath, the northern formations are what the Venkai call the first ground, Tesserath said. The geological record of Dusk Hollow's earliest period, the era in which life first took hold on the planet. For the Venkai, this is not a symbolic designation. They believe, based on a scientific framework that is different from yours, but not less rigorous, that the mineral record of that era contains preserved biological information. Memory, in a form they can access through certain techniques. The first ground is where they go to understand what they came from. The table was quiet for a moment. So we're asking them to share their ancestry. Morvain said, You are asking them to allow you to mine it, Sarath said, without particular emphasis, but with a precision that made the distinction very clear. Vasquez leaned forward, and they're still willing to negotiate. They are willing to negotiate, Sirath said, because they have spent 4 years studying humanity. They know that your need for extended propulsion range is not greed. It is the need of a species that is genuinely, physically, necessarily reaching outward. They understand reach. They understand the compulsion to extend beyond the limits of what you currently are. A pause. They are uncertain whether they trust you. But they find you interesting enough to test. Dusk Hollow appeared in the forward sensors on the morning of the 12th day. A dark amber sphere against the red light of its parent star, banded with the dark ochre of stone formations that even at this distance had a texture to them, a depth that the standard brown and gray palette of desert worlds didn't usually carry. Vasquez stood at the bridge viewport and looked at it the way she always looked at new worlds, not as a destination, but as a problem that hadn't fully stated itself yet. The Venkai vessel that matched course with them an hour later was unlike anything in the survey files. Earth Command's designers built ships that looked purposeful, functional geometries that declared their function in their shape. The Venkai ship was organic in its lines, curved and asymmetric in a way that might have looked unfinished to human eyes, if not for the absolute precision of its movement. It held its position relative to the meridian, with the casual accuracy of something that had been doing exactly this for a very long time. There's signaling, Ibarra said from his console. Text-based. Tesserath, I have it. Tesserath moved to the communications station with the unhurried speed of someone for whom urgency and calm were not opposites. The council representative is Venthalus, first rank of the deliberative assembly. This is a significant designation, the Venkai equivalent of a senior cabinet minister. They are taking this negotiation seriously. What's the message? The translation is, the ground has been prepared. We will speak in the place of wait. Ibarra looked at Vasquez. The place of wait? The northern continent, Sarath said. The first ground. They want to conduct the negotiation on the surface. Vasquez had anticipated something like this. How many of us? The invitation is extended to the captain and her necessary companions. No specific number. Tesserath paused. But the emphasis in the phrasing suggests they expect a small group. The Venkai distrust large delegations. They read them as posturing. Right. Ibarra, Morvain, Park, you're with me. Tesserath. Vasquez looked at the liaison. Will you come down? Tesserath looked at her with those luminous eyes and said nothing for a moment, in a way that felt like it meant something. Yes, Tesserath said. I will come. The shuttle descent gave them their first real look at the northern continent, and what Vasquez saw through the viewport recalibrated something in her sense of the mission. She had been to desert worlds before. She knew the grammar of them, the horizon syntax of eroded stone, the punctuation of wind-carved formations, the long empty sentences of flat pan. Dusk Hollow had all of that, but the Vareth formations rewrote it. The mineral deposits emerged from the stone in crystalline structures that caught the red starlight and held it differently in each layer. Deep amber at the surface grades, shifting to a darker arterial red deeper in, with a faint internal luminescence that wasn't a reflection of anything external. They grew in formations that were almost architecturally precise, columns and arches, and spreading horizontals that looked designed without being designed. The geological explanation for this regularity was in Park's briefing notes, something about crystal growth patterns under specific pressure conditions. But knowing the mechanism didn't make the sight less arresting. The Venkai didn't build those, Morvain said softly, looking out the viewport. No, Sareth said. They grew over approximately 400 million years. And the biological information you mentioned, the memory, the mineral lattice of the older formations contains organic inclusions. Microscopic but present. The Venkai use a form of resonance technique to access what those inclusions preserve. Sarath paused. It is not metaphor. It is science. I understand that the distinction matters to humans. They landed in a flat clearing between two of the great crystal formations, and the Venkai were waiting. There were 7 of them, arranged in a loose grouping that Vasquez's eye read as neither formal rank nor casual assembly but something more deliberate. A topology of relationship, she thought. A spatial diagram of how these people related to each other. 4 were in the pale gray garments that the briefing files had described as diplomatic dress. 2 were in darker practical clothing and stood slightly back. And 1 was forward of all the others. A Venkai taller than Tizerath by several inches, wearing something that incorporated Varath crystal in its structure. Thin laminate plates at the collar and shoulders, catching the light. This would be Venthalis. The counselor approached and stopped at a distance that Tesserath had explained to Vasquez was the Venkai distance of initial respect. Close enough to be heard clearly, far enough that no physical contact was possible without deliberate movement. Sarath moved to stand slightly to Vasquez's left and slightly behind. What followed was not quite a greeting and not quite an assessment. Venthalis said nothing immediately upon stopping. The counselor simply looked at Vasquez with the calm intensity of someone doing the kind of looking that takes time, and Vasquez did the instinctive human thing, which was to hold still and let herself be seen. She had learned this, actually. It was one of the few useful things the psychological evaluation had taught her, that certain kinds of being seen required stillness rather than explanation. The evaluators had framed it in clinical terms. She had understood it in a more personal way. You couldn't make someone understand what you'd been through. You could only stand in the presence of the fact of it and see whether they were capable of recognizing it. Venthalis spoke. Sarath translated. Near simultaneously, "You are the one who paid." Vasquez held the counselor's gaze. "I am another." Pause. Then Venthalis spoke again, longer this time, and Tesserath translated. "We will speak on the ground. You will walk with me. Your companions may observe." They walked for 2 hours among the formations. It was not what Vasquez had expected from a diplomatic opening. She had prepared for a structured session, a table, or its alien equivalent, formal exchange of positions, the careful back and forth of negotiation as she had practiced it. Instead, Venthalis walked at a measured pace between the crystal columns, and talked about the first ground, as though conducting a tour that was also a test. The counselor described the formation they called the anchor column, the tallest crystal structure in the northern continent, nearly 40 meters from base to apex, its internal luminescence a deep sustained red that Park had quietly pulled out his scanner to measure. Vasquez had quietly gestured him to put away. Venthalis described the biological inclusions within its lower strata, what they preserved, how the Venkai accessed them, what they had learned about the earliest life on Dusk Hollow from the mineral memory. The first organisms, Tesserath translated as Venthalis spoke, touching the crystal base gently, did not survive. The conditions were wrong. They adapted, then adapted again. Then the conditions changed faster than adaptation could follow, and they ceased. What remained in the stone was not them. It was the trace of what they had tried. We study that trace. We believe it teaches something about the nature of trying. Vasquez listened. You are not the first species to come here wanting the Vareth, Sarath translated as they walked on. There was a species we call the Vorek. You have no record of them. They predated your expansion by approximately 600 of your years. They came with a larger ship and a larger delegation, and a framework of trade proposals that were technically fair. We declined. Why? Because they did not ask why the first ground mattered. They asked only what the Vareth was worth. Venthalis stopped walking and turned to face Vasquez. Through Tesserath, you have not asked what it is worth. I know what it's worth to us, Vasquez said. I'm trying to understand what it's worth to you. The counselor looked at her for a long moment. Walk further, Tesserath translated. On the second day, things changed. It began with a sound. Abera heard it first on the sensors, a subsonic pulse that registered at the edge of the detection threshold, and then repeated at irregular intervals, each time slightly stronger. By the time Vasquez was summoned from the surface negotiation session back to the shuttle's comm link, the pulse had been identified. The Dreth, Sarath said, in a tone that was the first time Vasquez had heard genuine unease in the liaison's voice. Tell me. Tesserath's composure shifted, not broke but shifted, like a surface that had been still and was now responding to something beneath it. The Dreth are the other native species of Dusk Hollow. They are not spacefaring. They are not interested in negotiation. They inhabit the deep canyons of the southern and central continental zones, and for approximately the last 2 centuries they have maintained what the Venkai consider a stable, if cautious, boundary relationship. A pause. That boundary has moved. The pulse you are detecting is a Dreth territorial signal. They use subsonic frequencies for communication and coordination. This pattern, I recognize it from the historical records, is a gathering call. They're mobilizing. They are gathering to the northern formations, to the first ground. Terath's voice was even, but carrying something in its evenness that Vasquez read as controlled fear. This has not happened in recorded Venkai history. Vasquez looked at Venthalis, who had moved slightly away to confer with the 2 Venkai in practical clothing. The counselor's posture had changed, still controlled, but the composure had a different quality now, less ease and more effort. What do the Dreth want? She asked. Sarath said something to Venthalis in the Venkai language. The counselor responded at length. Sarath translated. The Venkai don't fully know. The Driath have no diplomatic tradition, and no shared language with the Venkai. Communication between the species has always been indirect, through territorial signals and physical boundary markers. The best interpretation the Venkai have is that the Dreth are responding to the presence of the Meridian. Your ship's arrival disturbed something in the deep canyon environment. The sensor sweeps, the landing, possibly the energy signature of the shuttle. The Dreth are reactive to unfamiliar energetic presences. They interpret unknown energy as territorial incursion. So our arrival provoked them. The Venkai believe so. Vasquez kept her voice even, and the Venkai didn't mention this was possible. A pause. Sirath translated the question. Venthalis replied. The counselor says that the probability was considered negligible, that no off-world visit in the last 2 centuries has produced this response. Sarath paused. The counselor also says, and I translate precisely, that humanity is apparently a special case. Vasquez absorbed this. Is that a complaint or a compliment? Sarath looked at her. I believe it is meant as an observation. Whether it reflects well on you is still being determined. The Dreth arrived at dusk. There were more of them than anyone had anticipated. The Venkai historical records had described a species of perhaps modest population, concentrated in the deep canyon systems. Intelligent in the biological sense, capable of complex, coordinated behavior, but essentially territorial and reactive. What emerged from the canyon mouths that opened into the first ground's southern edge was not modest. They were bipedal, roughly human-proportioned but broader at the shoulder, and with a spinal structure that gave them a forward lean in motion, a physicality that read as speed before anything else. Their coloring was the dark rust red of dusk-hollow stone, which had almost certainly served as camouflage for long enough that it had become ingrained in the body plan. They moved in coordinated groups with a fluidity that suggested practiced formation. Not the randomness of a mob, but the controlled organization of something that had done this before, even if this specific situation was unprecedented. The Venkai delegations pulled back toward the shuttle landing zone with the controlled urgency of people implementing a contingency plan. They had not told the humans they had. The two Venkai in practical clothing produced equipment from packs that resolved, at closer range, into some kind of barrier projection system. Energy deflection, Vasquez thought, personal scale, not designed to stop the Dreth, but to maintain distance. How long does that hold? Vasquez asked. Long enough, Venthalis said, through Tizerath, and the compression in the counselor's voice made the phrase feel more like a question than an answer. Vasquez had her own instinct firing, the one that had kept her alive through enough situations to trust. Not panic, not the adrenaline spike of threat response, but the deeper, colder clarity of someone recognizing the shape of a problem and the shape of the potential solution simultaneously. She turned to Park. Your xenolinguistics background. Anything useful in the Dreth subsonic signals? Park had his scanner out and had been recording since the gathering signal began. The frequency range is complex, multiple overlapping registers, but there's a base pattern that repeats. It's either a territorial claim or a warning. Possibly both. Up. If it's a warning, someone might be able to respond to it. Not in Dreth. I don't have enough to construct anything coherent, but possibly in kind. Match the frequency range. Produce a response that sits in the same register. Not language, but acknowledgement, like a territorial signal back, or a non-territorial one. The Dreth are reacting to something they read as invasion.
If we could produce a signal in their frequency range that didn't carry the signature.
Territorial threat. He hesitated. I'm speculating. What do you need? Bautista. Vasquez keyed her communicator. Bautista. Already listening. Bautista's voice came back. What do you need? I need the shuttle's ventral thruster array modified to produce a directed subsonic pulse. Park will give you the frequency parameters. The modification needs to be quiet. I don't want the Dreth to hear us working on it. A pause that lasted exactly as long as it needed to. That's not technically possible, Bautista said. The thruster array isn't designed for. Bautista. Give me 20 minutes. Tizerath had moved close to Vasquez during this exchange, and when Vasquez ended the communication, the liaison said, very quietly, what you are attempting has not been tried. Most things that work haven't been tried yet. Tesserath looked at her with an expression that carried more data than Vasquez could fully read. You are very calm. I'm terrified, Vasquez said, but I've learned that terrified and calm aren't opposites. You can be both. You'd be surprised. She looked at the advancing Dreth, now perhaps 300 meters away, the barrier system holding, but the quality of the energy between the two groups changing, thickening into something with the texture of an approaching decision. You'd also be surprised what that combination of things makes possible. Bautista took 18 minutes. The modification was, as she explained it afterward, technically elegant and practically terrifying. Not because of what it might do to the shuttle's thruster system, which she had calculated would survive, but because of what it might do to the situation, which she had not calculated and could not. Park fed her the frequency parameters. She configured the array. The test pulse was barely audible to human hearing, a low, felt more than heard resonance that moved through the soles of Vasquez's boots when the array produced it. The Dreth stopped, Ibarra said from the shuttle's sensor station, his voice carrying the particular quality of someone who has just seen an unexpected thing and is not yet ready to characterize it. The Dreth had, in fact, stopped. The forward elements of the group, those who had been closest to the Venkai barrier, perhaps 200 meters out, had halted with the synchronized abruptness of a flock of birds changing direction, a movement so coordinated it seemed impossible for it not to be deliberate. "What's the signal telling them?" Vasquez asked Park. "My best interpretation, and I want to emphasize this is interpretation, is something in the register of, I am here, and I am not a threat. The base frequency is territorial acknowledgement. The modulation Park design strips out the aggressive harmonics." He paused. "We're essentially saying, we can hear them. And we're saying it in the right register to be recognized as a deliberate response, rather than random noise. They recognize it as speech, or near enough to speech that it matters." Venthalis had come to stand beside Vasquez during the exchange, and Sirath was translating the conversation to the counselor in real time. When there was a pause, the counselor spoke. Sirath translated. "The Venkai have never communicated with the Dreth. I know. You have been here for less than 2 days. I know that too." Venthalis regarded her with that long, weighing gaze. "How?" Sarath translated, just a single word, carrying the weight of a much larger question. Vasquez considered how to answer this honestly. "We've been both," she said finally. "Humans, I mean. We've been the Venkai, and we've been the Dreth. We've built careful civilizations, and we've responded to the unknown with violence, and we've had to figure out what to do when the two things met." She looked at the stopped Dreth, still holding their position, the subsonic pulse continuing at irregular intervals, a kind of conversation conducted in frequencies below speech. "We understand both sides, because we've lived both sides. Not as a species virtue. We're not especially enlightened about it, but we know the texture of it from the inside." She turned to look at Venthalis directly. "That's the answer to your question. That's what one who has paid the price of understanding actually looks like. It doesn't look like wisdom. It looks like someone who got here by a road they would not have chosen." She held the counselor's gaze. "But they got here." Sarath had been translating as she spoke, and when she finished, the liaison said nothing for a moment. Then, softly, and this time, Vasquez was not sure whether Tesserath was translating the counselor or speaking in a personal capacity. Yes, they did. The night on Dusk Hollow was long by Earth standards, almost 20 hours of darkness, and they spent it on the surface rather than retreating to the meridian. This was not planned. It was simply what happened when the situation required presence, and presence required staying. Vasquez set watches and shifts, not because there was any immediate threat. The Dreth had withdrawn to a respectful distance after the second subsonic exchange and stayed there, occasionally producing signals that Park was building a functional lexicon from at a pace that alarmed everyone, including Park himself, but because it was the correct thing to do. You kept watch. That was a human behavior in a context like this, and she had stopped being self-conscious about demonstrating human behaviors in front of aliens. Venthalis remained on the surface as well. The counselor's delegation set up a small camp in the lee of the anchor column, and Vasquez found herself at the midpoint of the night, walking toward it without entirely planting dew. Tesserath materialized at her shoulder. The liaison had a quality of appearing at the right moment that Vasquez had come to rely on without fully understanding. Venthalis was sitting at the base of the anchor column with one hand resting against the crystal surface. Not a gesture Vasquez had seen from the Venkai before. "What are they doing?" she asked Tesserath quietly. "Listening," Sarath said. "The resonance technique I described, the mineral memory." A pause. "I think, and I may be wrong about this, that the counselor is asking the first ground what to do." Vasquez stood at the edge of the Venkai camp and watched. The starlight and the column's internal luminescence combined to produce a quality of light that was neither quite red nor quite amber. Something in between that gave everything the quality of an old photograph. She thought about the crew members she had buried. There had been 3. After the Kessel engagement, in the aftermath that she never talked about, there had been a small ceremony on the Meridian's observation deck, and then the long work of continuing, which was the only ceremony that actually mattered. She had not asked the universe what to do, because she did not believe the universe answered questions. But she understood, watching Venthalis, what the gesture was for. Not the answer. She'd given up expecting answers. The orientation, the standing in relation to, the physical act of contact with something larger than yourself that reminded you of the scale you were operating in, and that the scale was larger than the immediate crisis, and that the immediate crisis was important, but was not everything. She sat down at the base of one of the smaller formations, a few meters from the Venkai camp. Not intrusion, presence. Eventually, Venthalis turned and looked at her. Tesserath, who had settled nearby with the stillness of someone accustomed to waiting, translated the counselor's words. You also have this practice. Vasquez looked at the formation she was leaning against. Something like it. A long pause. We will give you the access you need. Tesserath translated as Venthalis spoke slowly, with a weight that was clearly deliberate, not to all of the first ground. A defined sector of the northern-eastern boundary, where the Varith density is sufficient for your purposes, and the biological inclusions are in the younger strata. Still significant, but not among the deepest record. This access will be governed by a joint protocol. Your teams and ours will work together. Nothing will be extracted without Venkai presence and authorization. Vasquez kept her expression steady. That's more than we came here expecting. You did more than we expected, the counselor said through Tsirath, and there was something in the phrasing, a faint inflection in the translated language, that suggested the statement was both an observation and a gift. There are conditions, Tsirath translated as Venthalis continued. You will maintain the communication with the Dreth. We do not ask you to take responsibility for them. That is our work, and it is long work that we have not been doing adequately. But you have opened a door we did not know was there. We ask that you help us understand how it was opened. Park, Vasquez said without turning. Already building the documentation, he said from behind her, and she could hear in his voice the sound of someone doing the thing they were made for. The betrayal came from above rather than below, which was how betrayals usually worked. The message arrived on the secured command channel at 3 Unarmed ship time, when Vasquez had gone up to the Meridian to sleep for the first time in 36 hours. Abara woke her with a knock rather than the communicator, which was how she knew it was something she needed to be standing up for. The message was from Admiral Cho's office, but the authentication signature didn't match Cho's personal code. It matched the override code for his office, which used when messages were sent in an official capacity by someone other than the Admiral himself. She had seen this twice in her career. Both times it had meant that someone was using institutional authority to do something the direct chain of command would not have approved. The content was brief. The negotiation was to be suspended immediately. The Meridian was to return to the Vandermeer corridor and await instructions. No explanation was given for the change of directive. No mention was made of the progress that had been made. Vasquez read it twice. Then she sat with it for a moment, in the way that Venthalis had sat with the crystal column. Not for an answer, but for orientation. She went to find Abara. He was in the briefing room with the message already on his own screen, and the expression of a man who had come to the same conclusion she had and was waiting to see how she would handle it. Who sent this? She said. Working on it. He turned the screen toward her. The override code traces back to the office of Deputy Director Arnett. He's not in Cho's direct chain of command. No, he's in the Logistics and Resources Division. She looked at the name. She knew of Arnett. Everyone in the command structure knew of Arnett, the same way you knew the topography of terrain you'd never walked, but might need to navigate. He was the kind of official who appeared in footnotes and committee approvals, whose influence was systemic rather than direct. He was also, she now recalled from a briefing she had attended 6 months ago, and had not fully attended to, the chair of the Energy Policy Committee that had been circling the Verith question for the last 2 years. He wants the negotiation to fail, she said. Abara looked at her steadily. That's a significant conclusion. It's the conclusion the facts support. She pulled up the Energy Policy Committee file on her screen. She read for 2 minutes in silence. Arnett's committee has an existing contract framework with the Cerevian Mining Consortium. The Cerevian drive systems are the primary alternative to the Verith-based propulsion we're negotiating for. If the Verith treaty goes through, the Cerevian contracts become significantly less valuable. That's enough too. It's enough for someone to decide that a failed negotiation is preferable to a successful one. She set down the tablet. The question is what we do about it. Abara looked at her with the expression of a man who had been waiting for exactly this question and had not quite worked out his own answer to it. The message is an official's directive from a senior official's office. We're legally required to. The message is an official directive sent without the knowledge of the flag officer who authorized this mission, using an override code to circumvent normal chain of command in a situation where complying with it would terminate a negotiation that is on the verge of succeeding and has directly benefited relations with a previously uncontacted species. She said it steadily, without heat, the way you stated facts. It is also a directive that would require us to abandon, without explanation, a Venkai delegation that has just extended significant trust based on our presence and conduct. That last one isn't in the regulations. No, it's not. She looked at the message on the screen. Contact Admiral Cho directly, not the office, his personal channel. Wake him up if you have to. It's 3 a.m. It's also a significant strategic situation. He'll want to know. Cho, it turned out, had not been aware of the message. He was, as became clear from the 12-minute conversation that followed, aware of Arnett's committee and the Cerevian contract situation. And he was, in his measured way, furious. A fury that expressed itself as an extended silence, followed by instructions that were precise and unhurried, and left no ambiguity about his position. Complete the negotiation, Captain, he said. Document everything. I will handle Deputy Director Arnett. The formal agreement was signed. If signed was the right word for what was actually an exchange of crystalline data wafers inscribed with molecular signatures from both parties. On the 3rd day, in the early morning, with the red star of Duck's Hollow rising behind the anchor column, and the Cocklam's luminescence shifting to its dawn register, a deeper amber that Sareth said the Venkai considered particularly auspicious. Vasquez had stopped thinking about what the Venkai considered auspicious and started simply seeing what she saw, which was this: a tall alien counselor and a human captain standing in the long amber light between formations that were 400 million years old, formalizing an agreement that neither of their species had expected to make, watched by a Dreth contingent from a respectful distance, and by a Venkai human liaison whose expression had, for the first time in the 11 days Vasquez had known them, settled into something that looked unequivocally like ease. Venthala spoke at some length before the formal exchange. Trith translated. The counselor says, the first ground has witnessed many things it did not expect to witness. The Vorik who came to take. Species who came to study and remained indifferent. Species who came with respect and left without understanding. You came with need, and the counselor says this without judgment, because need is honest. But you did not let need make you blind. You saw the first ground, and you asked what it meant. You saw the Dreth, and you asked who they were. You saw our difficulty, and you did not make it yours, but you helped us see it differently. A pause. The counselor asks, is this a human quality or a quality of individuals? Vasquez thought about this. Both, she said, and neither. Humans are capable of it. We are also capable of the opposite. What I would say, is that it is a capacity that humans have, and whether it expresses depends on the situation and the people in it. She looked at Venthalis. Today, in this situation, with these people, it expressed. Tesserath translated. Venthalis listened and then did something that the liaison had told her the Venkai rarely did in formal settings. The counselor smiled. Not quite a human smile. The musculature worked differently. The result was subtly alien, but unmistakably the same thing. They buried Ensign Takeda on the southern slope of the first ground, on the afternoon before departure. This had not been planned. Takeda had been in Morvaine's care since the second day on the surface, a complication from a pre-existing condition that had been stable, and then, in the way that things that are stable become unstable, was not. Morvaine had done everything that could be done. It wasn't enough, which was the sentence that Vasquez had said too many times, and never said easily. She had asked Venthalis, with full expectation of refusal, whether the burial of a human crew member in the first ground was something that could be permitted. She had not framed it as a negotiating point, or a request tied to the treaty. She had framed it as one person asking her for something that mattered. The counselor had been quiet for a long time. Then, the first ground is for those who have paid. Vasquez had held still and been seen. Bring him here, Tesheth had translated. They dug the grave by hand, which was not required. The Meridian had equipment that could have done it in a fraction of the time, but which was the right thing. Park dug, Ibarra dug, Vasquez dug. Bautista came down from the ship and dug without being asked. Morvaine stood at the edge of the site and watched the way a doctor watches when the work has passed beyond medicine. Several Venkai came to stand nearby, not participating but present, in the way that Tesserath had explained the Venkai marked, witnessed events, as testimony, as record, as the social acknowledgement that something had happened here and was now part of the record of this place. There was no eulogy. Vasquez had never been good at eulogies, at the translation of a person's life into words adequate to its weight. She stood at the grave with the amber light on her face, and the subsonic hum of the Dreth in the ground beneath her feet, and the smell of dusk hollow, stone in the cold air, and she thought about the trace that things left in mineral. The fact that being here, being a presence in a place, was itself a kind of inscription. The fact that the first ground had now received a human, and that in some geological accounting, that would not be measured for millions of years, that would be part of its record. She had not expected to find comfort in that. It surprised her. The departure was quiet. Tesserath was not returning to Earth Command Central. The Venkai liaison would remain on Dusk Hollow for the initial period of the joint protocol implementation, serving as the intermediary between the Verath Access Team and the Venkai Oversight Committee. This had been decided without drama, in the final phase of the negotiation, and had the quality of something that was simply correct, rather than decided. Vasquez and Terath stood at the shuttle ramp before boarding. I want to ask you something, Vasquez said. Yes. When you first told me the Venkai were looking for someone who had paid, that they'd researched humanity and identified me specifically. She paused. Did they know what they were asking for? Did they know that someone like that would handle this situation the way it was handled? Tesserath considered this with the long, honest consideration that Vasquez had come to understand was not hesitation, but respect for the question. No, the liaison said. They knew that a person who had paid would understand the value of the first ground. They believed that would be sufficient for the negotiation. A pause. They did not anticipate the Dreth situation. They did not anticipate the internal betrayal you faced. They did not anticipate what you would do in those circumstances. Tesserath looked at her with those luminous eyes. No one anticipated what you would do, including, I think, you. Vasquez laughed. A short, surprise sound that she hadn't planned. That's probably the most accurate thing anyone has said to me in a year. The Venkai will record this period of the first ground's history in their primary archive, Tesserath said. The record will include your name and the name of the Meridian and the name of Takeda. It will include the first communication with the Dreth. It will include the agreement. A pause. It will also include the quality of your presence here, not as data but as character. The Ven archive preserves both. Vasquez didn't say anything for a moment. What word will they use, she asked. For us, Sarath said a word in the Venkai language, a word that was all liquids and rising tones, something that sounded like water moving over stone. The translation is imprecise, Sarath said, but the nearest equivalent would be those who arrived carrying their weight and did not put it down. Vasquez held the word for a moment. Good, she said. That's good. She went up the ramp. The shuttle lifted. Below her, growing smaller, Titsarath stood between the crystal formations in the amber light, and the great formations caught the star's red glow and held it in their mineral depth. The way things hold what they have witnessed. The way the ground holds the weight of what has stood on it. Permanent, in the way that only the slow and patient and geological can be permanent. While above it, the ship that carried the humans climbed away toward the dark, and the distances that waited to be crossed. Cho met her personally when the Meridian docked at Earth Command Central, which was not standard protocol, and was therefore itself a communication. Arnett's committee is under review, he said, before she had fully cleared the gangway. I assumed. The treaty documentation has already been reviewed by the Deputy Secretary's office. They are characterizing it as... He paused in the way of someone selecting from several options. A significant diplomatic achievement of unusual depth and complexity. Park wrote the xenolinguistic component, Vasquez said. Morvain's cultural assessment is the best piece of work I've seen in this field in a decade. Ibarra's tactical documentation is thorough. Bautista, she paused. Bautista made something that shouldn't have been possible work perfectly, under conditions that shouldn't have permitted it. I hear all of that, Cho said. I'm also asking how you are. She thought about Sarath's word, the liquid sound of it, the image it carried. Ready, she said. He looked at her for a long moment, with the careful eye of someone who had been in the business of assessing people long enough to have gotten very good at it. For what? Whatever's next. She looked past him at the harbor through the windows, the light on the water, the ordinary blue of an Earth sky after 2 weeks under alien red, the familiar weight of the planet's gravity settling into her bones. There's always something next. The trick is not to be surprised when it looks different than you expected. Cho studied her. You've changed. I went somewhere I hadn't been, she said simply. That's what happens. She thanked him and walked out into the ordinary light of the day, carrying what she carried, not putting it down, which was the only way it could be carried, and was, she had come to understand, also the only way it could be transformed into something other than weight, into ballast, into foundation, into the thing beneath your feet, that made it possible to walk forward, into the places that had not been named yet. That would need names, that would need people willing to go there and pay the price of understanding what they found. The harbor was bright. The sky was blue. The ground was solid beneath her. She walked.